Good afternoon. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you to the BW Legal World Saturday Solutions webinar. BW Legal World in the last 23 months has emerged as the number one website on the intersection of business and law. We aspire and we are on our way to become the homepage of GCs, add value. When I say GCs, that pretty much means once the GCs are your go-to PG, all the stakeholders are involved. Today, we're discussing something which is relevant to all businesses and hence to the GCs that take strategic decisions as part of the businesses. We are discussing the changing landscape of compliances. We're looking at the challenges, trends, and what are the solutions that the in-house legal departments or the GCs are creating, because some of these challenges, some of these things that are coming up, some of the regulatory issues that are coming up are new. Let me introduce the panel in no particular order. Ms. Praveen Mehtani, she's the Chief Legal Officer of Mahindra Lifespace Developers. Ms. Mehtani, welcome to the conversation. Mr. Sumit Singh is the General Counsel and Head Corporate Strategy at BharatPe. BharatPe has made a lot of strides in the last 18 months. We have Mr. Satyajit Gupta, who's VP and Assistant General Counsel and Head of India in terms of legal issues and CSR for EXL Services. And last but not the least, we have Mr. K. Satish Kumar, who's the Senior Vice President and Group Chief Legal Officer of Intellect Design Arena. Let me start by asking Ms. Mehtani for her opening comments, go around the house, and then dive into nuanced issues. Ms. Mehtani, your opening comments on how is the landscape changed, where are we headed, and what are the kind of solutions that GCs are creatively looking at?
Thank you, firstly, for inviting me to this session. And the entire regime in the last 2 years for a general counsel has changed substantially. Because we are working in this hybrid fashion now, there is a lot of online compliance. Business has to go on as usual, given the limited interaction. So all of it really rests on the digital preparedness of the company, whether it's just at the board meetings and AGMs that we've been conducting online. In my sector specifically, I would like to say for the real estate sector, it has been not so difficult, because with the Real Estate Act, which came in 5 years back, it has been a forward-looking legislation. It had adapted to technology, where right from registration of the project to its quarterly compliance, it was in any case online. Therefore, adaptation to it during COVID has not been so difficult. We were able to do launches as well as manage the compliances because it was online. I think the only compliance regime that really needs to be looked at in a nutshell is there need to be more relaxations for physical requirements, because there is a physical survey. Sectors, businesses operated in a physical space. Therefore, there needs to be a hybrid connect of working and address the data privacy issues, where we are as a country still at quite a nascent stage.
Thank you so much. Ms. Mehtani, I started my career after having passed out of the Management Development Institute 27 years back in real estate. I was part of the setup team of Colliers, so I understand. We also own India's #1 real estate magazine. So the two sectors that I know a little bit about are real estate and media. Don't know too much about that, but I know a little bit. The more you know, the less you know. But thank you for outlining the issues. Yes, the real estate sector, especially the commercial real estate sector, for a while saw demand shrinking. Co-working spaces saw demand shrinking, but now they're coming back with a vengeance. The residential sector initially saw the demand going down, but in the first 2-3 months, but in the last 16 months, the residential sector has bounced back in a big way, because more and more people are realizing that home is where they spend most time. They're taking bigger homes, so that if there are 4 people who need to be on video conferencing, or the husband, wife, they're both working, children who are both studying, or in some cases even the adults who are both working. So clearly residential demand in Bangalore, Mumbai, especially these 2 cities, even in Pune, has come back. And in a couple of months it's likely to be peak or surpassed the peak, and people saved a lot of money, and that money is going into buying house. The real estate sector will see revival, but you rightly raised the question of virtual AGMs, virtual board meetings, however physical realm exists in real estate, because at the end of the day, as you said, you need to measure, you need to see, while you can do a walkthrough, even sales. I know end-to-end sales are happening without a visit also in some cases, I'm aware. But overall, even real estate was a category that was not bought on internet, but at least out of the 5 pieces of a real estate transaction, 4 are happening now online. In most cases, the visit is the last thing, but which is still happening physically. So we'll come back to you in a nuanced way on what are the changes. But let me bring in Mr. Sumit Singh. Fintech is a sector that is really at the cusp of a revolution. And in India, we are second to none in terms of the quality or quantity of transactions and the technology that we've deployed. And BharatPe has made tremendous strides in the last 18 months. So let me bring in Mr. Sumit Singh. Also in IPOs, we saw a Paytm IPO, we saw the numbers, and I'll not go into the stock price being low, that's a separate discussion. But the fact is, Vijay has created a company which got $20 billion of valuation on the day of the listing. So clearly, fintech is a sector, its best is ahead of it. So, and it's a sector, there are too many nuances because the government and the RBI like to protect the money of the retail investors, of the people who put their money in the bank, people who are doing transactions. So it's a very regulated sector, more regulated than a lot of other sectors. So Sumit, your opening comments would be welcome. And I forgot to introduce my editorial colleague, who's the backbone of BW Legal World, Mr. Krishnendra Joshi. He will also join me in asking. It's his first video interview, so be nice to him. I'm sure he'll be very nice to all of you. Mr. Sumit Singh, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Anurag, for having me here, and privileged to be sharing this with the rest of the distinguished panelists. Fintech, as you rightly said, is the flavor of the year of probably post-pandemic, right? Where we are seeing some of the largest transactions happening in fintech, but that's also given that you're in financial space. When you say that it's regulated, I will say that probably it's on the way to getting regulated, because and if you're keeping track of what is happening in fintech, we would have seen a couple of days back the RBI committee under Mr. Jayant Das submitting a very, very important report, which is now open for public comment on November 18, where the report on the working group was submitted for essentially regulating the digital lending platform, and to also come out with a broad framework on how the digital lending apps are going to be regulated. This also was a function of what happened a couple of years back, and probably at the start of the pandemic, when a lot of Chinese apps were banned, and there were a lot of loan apps which were mushrooming all over on iOS and web. Some of the economically poor people were kind of cheated, and high interest rates were charged to them. And because of those, that necessitated the RBI to come out to form a committee under Mr. Jayant Das, who is the executive director of RBI, to form a committee to essentially come out with a framework to, and just to put some numbers, right, there are over 2,000 fintechs in the country, and over 67% has come out in the last 3 to 4 years. Fintech has also attracted millions and millions of dollars of FDI. There are some of the over 30 unicorns which has come out this year, and even before that, there are several unicorns now in fintech space, right? We being one of them, but there are so many others. So given the money and the fact that you are attracting and you are dealing with public money, there is obviously a need to regulate in some form or another. Given obviously one part of fintech which we'll talk through on this session is also NBFCs, which are already regulated, or the banks which are already regulated who are doing lending. But RBI and Government of India, obviously, what we are picking up, and rightfully so, also would want to have a visibility on how the non-regulated fintechs are operating. And to this end, this committee report, which is is going to be very helpful. So over 150-page report, and I think last 2 days I've been spending reading this report because that would form the basis of how the laws or even oversight. RBI is still promoting a self-regulation, which I think is the way to go, with some sort of regular compliance and reporting to RBI or to the regulated entities such as NBFCs. As you know, these fintechs primarily partner with regulated entities like NBFCs or small finance bank. We also just got a small finance banking license a few weeks ago. So to partner with these regulated entities to offer broad sense of financial products, right? And where fintechs indeed play a very important role is that the outreach for the economically poor people and probably people who banks are not ready to underwrite. Fintechs are facilitating that deep penetration into the rural and semi-urban area, which is really impacting the lives of millions of people in a positive manner.
Absolutely. So, Sumit, thank you for laying that landscape. I would, when I come back to you, I'd want you to give me 1 or 2 instances which you can publicly share. Some maybe privileged and confidential information and sensitive. I don't to kind of buttress the points you made. To give us an instances of what was the challenge you faced and what was the solution you came up with. Now, let me bring in Mr. K. Satish Kumar. Mr. K. Satish Kumar, your opening comments. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Anurag, and thanks for inviting me to this forum. It's my privilege to be a speaker in this forum. Compliance cannot be underestimated. It's one of the most important, it's one of the most important aspect in any. We are also a fintech company, so for any fintech organization, I can say. And any light, if you take compliance very lightly, the directors are being penalized. Not only there is a civil action, there is also a criminal action on the directors if there is a failure to do compliance. The importance of compliance cannot be underestimated. Being part of a large organization, we have subsidiaries and footprints across the globe. And once you have footprints across the globe, the compliance for the respective geographies also manifests into a big requirement. So as a in-house general counsel, it's my primary responsibility to ensure that we take care of the compliance not only in India but across the geography in other areas where we have our affiliates and subsidiaries. So there has been many instances where many companies have been shut down because of not being complying with the requirement, and many directors have been penalized. So the compliance is a very critical aspect for any organization.
Thank you so much. We know, and we'll dive into examples, specific. Last but not the least, let me bring in Mr. Satyajit Gupta. Satyajit, your opening comment, and then we'll start the second round with you.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Batra, and thanks again for BW early Business World putting together this pretty awesome panel. So actually, and it's an interesting topic because this last year particularly has been a year of many challenges, and I think compliance was a challenge for almost every company. Even though I belong to a sector which largely is service exporting, and we don't have consumers in India, but we still had all kinds of issues and compliance challenges which started from meeting our requirements because we are registered under various schemes such as SEZ, STPI, and various others, and while we have minimal oversight there, but there are certain regulations which need to be, we need to obtain exemptions, such as the place of working. We are also regulated in some sense by the DOT. So all of those, I think, were critical ones. And also, I think it was very interesting and also, I think, at times challenging, because on the EHS and labor side, the government came up with multiple notification circulars and tracking all of those across different states. We are present in 9 locations across India. and that was also an interesting, sort of exercise, doing that constantly. And finally, I think overall, I would agree with all the panelists that there have been global compliance challenges as well, because across various jurisdictions, we've seen data privacy laws coming through, whether it's, of course, 2018 was GDPR, then CCPA came in last year, then the South African laws are coming in, the laws coming in Brazil, and of course, India is trying to follow somewhere. So I think there are multiple regulations, laws, and various challenges coming through. And I think I would just finally end with just mentioning that Parveen mentioned about the hybrid working model of work from home, that has not been a very significant driver in India, but it's now become a very interesting thing of how much and what are the risks that it exposes the enterprise to, how much can you regulate, how do you monitor, and to what extent should you go to monitor and control employees who are working from various locations across the country. So I think that's my quick thoughts, and back to you, Dr. Batra.
So, you're a mind reader, Satyajit, because I was going to talk about legal risk, and you used the word legal risk. So as per a survey done by Deloitte, 41% of non-banking and 14% of banking companies have no definition of legal risk. I'm not referring to any particular company. We're talking in general across the spectrum and the universe. There are increased reported cases of fines on corporates in this sector. So clearly in-house counsels are thinking about it. They're defining legal risk, they're ring fencing it, they're coming up with solutions. So how do you build a playbook and a solution-oriented approach which is proactive in minimizing legal risk? I mean, compliance is compliance, but the legal risk is a little larger than compliance. So Satyajit, I'd like you to address it, and then I'll go around the house.
Sure, Dr. Batra. So I think absolutely, I think, and I think it's probably not only something which has come up in the last year, but definitely last year has been, I think for many companies, including mine, it's been tremendous in terms of how everybody's found the GC's office as one of the first ports of call, right? I mean, earlier people used to be like, "Acha, chalo, we'll manage," and go to the lawyer at the last minute. But now people start coming to us much earlier.
Yeah, and I keep saying, I said it in our conference on 23rd October when we launched, that for the first time, there's a long way to go, but for the first time, I see more and more GCs on the board. We've done a research. And in US or Europe, if a GC on the board said to the chairman that this can't be done, it won't happen. So really, there is a risk is being recognized, and the role of the GC in minimizing that risk is being recognized, and the GC is being called more often to be able to deal with it. Go on, Satyajit.
Absolutely, and I think a quick I would say response to, or rather a segue from your point, and I'll quickly come back also to your question, is that in India, a lot of companies used to have, GCs or legal officers reporting to the CFO, and finally their point of view is to get distilled from a financial and economics angle before coming out to the board. Now, as you absolutely are right, on the Indian side as well, the GCs are, have direct access, direct reporting, and I think that's a tremendous change. So quickly, I think on the point around building a legal risk playbook, I think in the Indian context, I would say it's probably not as widespread. I think there's still a lot of in-house counsel who are reacting, but yeah, I mean, this last year has shown that just to take an example, and probably a sort of slightly weird example. I mean something as simple as for us, because we handle a lot of data, information security is a big issue for us, and it's both in certain countries it's a legal risk because you would be in violation of laws if, let's say data gets leaked. In the Indian context, because we didn't really have a very strong law, but we still have considerable contractual risk of the counterparty suing us or cancelling a contract or terminating a contract or claiming damages. So we have now internally built a mechanism to have this analyzed very, initially as soon as a information security incident gets reported, and we've overhauled that entire, management process, and that's happened over the last year and a half. And I think, and while it was happening, this work from home happened, and we started to see obviously cases coming up where people were sitting at home and just probably taking screenshots of what they were up to on the screen, or people posting stuff on Facebook, even inadvertent leaks, and of course there is leaks which were intended as well. So I would say definitely it's a time for more and more councils to build and find the risks that they are encountering and build a proactive mechanism to deal with it.
Thank you so much. Let me bring in Ms. Praveen Mahatani on the same point of how you're contextualizing legal risk and how you're building a playbook to minimize legal risk.
Yes, thank you. I think Satyajit summarized it well. What has really happened, and the way I would see it, is there has been an increase in the quantum of penalties. Therefore, the attention of companies to their risks has increased, because it is not just a nominal amount anymore in a lot of sectors. The consequence of whether insolvency is getting triggered, the way insolvency courts are looking at it, even say if you take the real estate sector where home buyers have been included, the criminal liability, the ability to where bails are not being granted in corporate cases. So all of that as a consequential impact is the reason why there is a mindset shift, if I can put it, to a seriousness in wanting to understand what is the legal risk, what is the risk mitigation strategy, and the role of the GC in then highlighting that and providing solutions is where the role itself has transgressed. So that's in a very simple summary where really it is. There was always a legal risk, but it is how we are reacting to it, and the slow and steady changes to the penalties and the consequences and the way the courts are reacting has highlighted the attention towards the legal risks.
Thank you so much. Let me now bring in Mr. Sumit Singh. Mr. Sumit Singh, your point of view on legal risk, and in your sector, possibly because of the new frontiers that you're conquering, new business models, if I may say, new ideas, possibly it's more than others.
So that's true. I think fintech and some other sectors which currently and somebody the other day and earlier also, government anywhere becomes very uncomfortable, whether it is fintech or crypto or online gaming and some of the other sectors. Fintech probably, given that still you have an oversight because you end up working with a regulated entity as compared to some of the other sectors. I think regulator will always be a bit uncomfortable if they don't have a full visibility in the sector in which you're operating, especially when you're dealing with the public money, right? And there is great amount of sensitivity around if you're in a financial sector. That also puts, and at least for our company and some of the other large companies, we do a very strict amount of self-regulation, and we look ourselves and test ourselves with the same criteria which is applicable on a regulated entity, whether when you're looking at any of the KYC direction or dealing with the sensitive information or your data. The test is always to look at that if you're a regulated entity, how would you deal with it? Even though there is no clear prescribed law, the NBFC is required to come out with a fair practice code. There is a under their own NBFC master direction, RBI in June last year came out with the outsourcing guideline, which was applicable on digital platforms, and again putting the onus back on the NBFC. So they've been talking to the NBFCs and the banks and putting the onus on the regulated entity because that's the entity which actually reports to RBI. But having said that, the trend I have seen industry, which is not only limited to us, is that all the large fintech and mid-sized fintech companies are the way they operate is that they ensure that they work within the boundaries of the law and also have robust compliance mechanism to ensure that whatever documents, agreements you are facilitating on your platform, because even that is being entered into between the borrower and a regulated entity, right? And some of the outsourcing which is being done by the NBFC in terms of collection services, because that's one of the services which Fintech does in terms of processing the entire end-to-end application, a loan application, for example, is that the process is not driven by the tech and with minimal human intervention. And when it is being driven by tech, then the chances of anything going wrong, because you've already factored all of that while writing that, either the API or the code, ensure that the process is very smooth and easy for the end consumer and the borrower. And as far as the other compliances are concerned, the teams, and that's why if you see and if you look at all the fintechs, the legal team, the secretarial team, just which is happening not only for us but other sectors also, is going at a very fast pace, right? Where the teams are expanding, because there is obviously a recognition that your compliance has to be robust. Even if you're not a regulated entity as of now.
We understand that. Sumit, I need specific examples. Give me one instance where you saw something that was from a legal risk high, you addressed it, in as much detail as you can. I understand that sometimes full details should not be and may not be discussed, but give us an example. Nothing works like an example.
Sure. So if you look at different products which financial, we even, and let me give this example from a regulated side, right? And consumer, there will always be some other question, because for consumer, is the front is always the fintech company, right? There may be 10 partners, 10 NBFC you would have partnered with, but for them, they're dealing with Bharat Pay or Paytm for that matter, right? Although they are not really lending from their balance sheet, right? But from a regulator point of view, I think whenever you come out with the product, right, is what we have seen, and I've been engaged in several of those conversations with the Reserve Bank of India, is that there are if they have some questions, right, that in terms of how you're doing the KYC, how what kind of reporting you're doing, how is that NBFC, and that's a conversation which happens with the regulated entity and the platform with the regulator. That if we come out with if to give an example, we launched a buy now pay later product called Postpay, which was one of the sponsors for the recently concluded World Cup 2020, which happened last week. So Postpay is a buy now pay later product of Bharat Pay. When we came out with the product, that was our venture, other than the 12% club, which was an earlier consumer product. That was our real foray into consumer space. Otherwise, Bharat Pay was for last 3.5 years since its incorporation, primarily a B2B company. Right, we work on the merchant side. That's why you, as a consumer, you may not have a Bharat Pay app, but probably as a consumer, you may have a Postpay app, which is a Bharat Pay, which is buy now, pay later app. So, whenever there is, so we had a conversation with the regulator also, and there to take them through each step of the product, right, for them to get comfortable and to factor in their comments, right, that this is the disclaimer you should be putting on your app. This is something in terms of reporting, or are you ensuring that you're giving a copy of the loan, a sanction letter to the consumer, right? That's something which anyway is an obligation. So to walk the regulator through each and every step, right? Whenever you come out with a product, what I have seen is that regulators become also very proactive. There are young officers who have access to all sort of technology. They can also download the app. They like to actually go through the entire life cycle of a product to understand how...
Understood. Yeah. Mr. K. Satish Kumar, you're in the same boat in the sense of the sector that you're in. Your inputs and some example and some nuanced situations that you dealt with would be welcome.
What I will say is compliance, you have to be always on the, to be ahead of the curve, the requirement ahead of the curve. I can quote a specific example. Say, for example, in our organization, where a payroll is being processed, you cannot get into the department with your handphone. And it's a very restricted environment. The systems are restricted, and you have to, while entering, you have to enter with your name and password because of the payroll processing for multiple clients. I am talking of one of the instances that in one of the previous organizations that I had worked. And now, after this COVID coming into the picture, everybody started working from home. So once you start working from home, you are free for all. You get your mobile, you have your laptop, you can take pictures. So the clients are very, now the clients have become very finicky. Now they want to know how are you able to protect the information that is being processed, because that's a question that has come from the client, and our playbook naturally has to be kept on being updated based on the requirement. So the internal policies and processes have to be updated. So when no other department can answer a query of the customer, naturally it falls on the shoulder of the GC. So as a GC, it has come to me. So the question is, how do you organize, or how do you ensure that the same level of confidentiality, the same level of security as was there in the organization keeps continuing in the work from home or work from anywhere that continues. So the answer is something very critical. You need to take a picture of at random pictures, random pictures at various intervals that you take. So these are some of the examples that I can give. So the compliance requirement is always changing and dynamic. The cost of compliance is also increasing. So I will not say that it's not a wasteful expenditure. It's a very worthy expenditure, which is an investment into the organization, which is a capital investment, I'll say, which goes a long way in building confidence with the clients. So I will say this one instance that I had come about, and there are other instances where where I would like to say that the so-called whistleblowers that are there in the organization. So first we have to distinguish whether the person who leaks out the information, is he really a whistleblower, or is he a person who has for some other motive sent out the information.
Absolutely.
So sent out the information outside the organization. So this is a very critical thing that you have to identify first. And we have in fact taken action against one of the employee, and the disgruntled employee post his being terminated from the system started spreading information about the false information about the organization outside the system, not only to the clients but to everyone else. And sometimes we have to receive the uncomfortable questions from the client, and we have to face them. We have to give them the confidence or assuage them of how as a listed company, how we have a rock solid compliance system in the organization, and how there are various regulators which are monitoring this compliances in order to build confidence. So these are some of the instances that I can give where the compliance requirement has kept on changing our playbook.
Absolutely. Now, because both of you, lots of mergers and acquisitions have happened during lockdown. Now, a merger and acquisition is about culture. That aspect is missing, when you do integration. But it's a lot about due diligence also. How do you make sure, from a compliance standpoint, from a legal risk standpoint, you do the right due diligence? Let me start with Mr. K. Satish Kumar this time. Mr. K. Satish Kumar, it's a whole new world.
Yeah, see, I will give an instance. As I always tell, you come to attorneys and you take the worst case scenario. So if it is a best case scenario, you don't want to go to an attorney. So I will give a worst case scenario where in one of the mergers, not necessarily in my company, I'm just giving a scenario which has actually happened and which has come to my knowledge. where we had done a due diligence and we had acquired the company. And subsequently, we came to know that it was in a free zone of the company, and the company had mutated the document between another builder, between the builder and the company, and the state government had issued a legal notice to the company of why they should not cancel the allotment of the land. And this notice was not brought to the picture of the company which had acquired the the other company. And as a GC, there is a restriction about how much deep dive you can do, how much due diligence you can do, and how much external with regulators, various regulators you can check. You can check with a couple of regulators, but there are few blind spots which you may not be able to do, and which will come and hit you in a big way. Maybe you don't know, 1, 2 years, 3 years down the line after the acquiring of the company, you come to know that there was a legal notice that was sent long back, and the legal action is sitting right in front of you. So these are some of the M&A scenarios that had come to my knowledge, where I will say that because of due diligence not being able to identify the right spots which had come and hit the organization in a big way. So yeah, due diligence during M&A is very critical, and you should take a good amount of time, deep dive as much as possible, and cross-refer with multiple regulators to ensure that the company that you are acquiring or the M&A that is happening, you do proper, so that you are safe to some extent. But yes, you should be aware about the blind spots as well.
Thank you so much. Same question to Ms. Mathani, Satyajit, and in the end to Sumit.
Yes, thank you. So the deals have been taking place in an online platform. And according to me, if the deals have an effective strategy, it is possible to perform despite all the ongoing hurdles. When there is a sudden conversion from that physical to a virtual business environment, what has really now become important is the handling of confidential data during that due diligence process. It becomes very case sensitive, and the entire coordination which is required between teams has become indispensable. So the way we're using virtual data rooms, because especially in land deals, it is extremely voluminous. It goes down right to probably a panchayat level diligence. And that's the combination of a virtual diligence and a physical diligence which cannot be avoided. And therefore, searches are probably taking longer than before. What has been a major shift in trend is negotiations on transaction documents. There is a large acceptability to doing M&A transactions virtually. I myself concluded a 36-hour negotiation, which was completely on Teams, and concluded that. The other areas of diligence because of COVID, which have become important, is checking the financial insolvency of the party that you're dealing with. Because the target company or the joint venture partner, that diligence is important, because it could be at the brink of insolvency, and there would be substantial amount of time and money is spent in trying to do a transaction. So there is a requirement not just for legal and technical diligence, but even a financial diligence, as there's an increased requirement for it. The way term sheets, LOIs, MOUs being done as a precursor to any transaction is being relooked with from a force majeure point of view, which could be used by a target company or joint venture company to not perform its obligations and wriggle out with no forfeitures, etc. So that's the other thrust of how term sheets, MOUs are being looked at prior to an M&A transaction being implemented. So that's where really the entire shift in M&A transactions has taken place.
Ms. Mathani, I'd get quick comments from Satyajit and then from Sumit before I bring Krishnendra into the conversation.
No, yeah. I'll just jump in, and I think obviously great points from Satish sir and Parveen. I think, and also Dr. Batra, very interesting question. I think, and of course, observation which is which has been made over the last year or so in terms of the number of strategic deals, etc., going up, and in fact, asset purchases as well, because there's been a lot of some amount of it may have been due to economic distress, some of it may have been strategic divestments, etc. I would say, and really the importance of due diligence cannot be under sort of, or rather overestimated or spoken about. But for me, I think, and I think most of the due diligence these days, I think for the last, in fact, few years, a lot of it happens anyways online and using virtual platforms, etc. But the importance of making certain physical checks, especially for assets, especially for immovable properties, etc., cannot be understated. I think there is definitely a lot of risk which can be avoided by ensuring multiple checks and cross references, as Satish also mentioned. And I think one interesting point, which I think which has become a big one, especially for private enterprises which are being acquired, I believe, and it's been for some time, and for me is a particularly pet topic, is related party transactions. There's a tremendous amount of related party transactions which tend to happen within private enterprises, and even certain cases, notionally public enterprises which are not listed, and in fact, I am assuming certain listed entities as well. So I think watching out for those and ensuring the actual value of the entity and the asset can be identified is pretty important. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Batra.
Sumit, your final comments, and then Krishnendra wants to come in on one or two issues that he feels strongly about.
So I've been an M&A lawyer all my life. I was a partner at Amachan before this, and Sajid, also coming from a law firm background, like we will tell you whether when I was on the side of the table and now here we acquired, after joining BharatPe, we did one and the only one M&A which BharatPe has done till date was the acquisition of Payback from Amex and ICICI. Payback, as some of you know, is India's largest loyalty point-based company, and we acquired from Amex. When you're doing an M&A, and this is something which I used to believe even when I was on the advisor side representing several clients, is that how the company has been run and your management, right, becomes very important, that who is the outgoing promoter and how the company has been run. Like we acquired from Amex, which is known globally to run a very clean company, and whether it is in India or otherwise, and their compliances and their legal team, their compliance report are pretty effective and solid, right? And that's the comfort, at least in our M&A. Even when I was at Amachan, we used to look at the promoter and how the company is, because that gives you a broad sense on how the company has been
Understood. So, now there are a couple of Gaurav Vats has a question, Supriya Roy has a question. We'll take those questions, but before that, Mr. Joshi, your question to the panelists.
Yeah, my question is for Mr. Gupta. I wanted to switch gears and talk about data privacy. So, is India Inc. ready for the challenge?
Yeah, because the data privacy law is being keenly awaited. And again, there is always a fear that, there may be over-regulation, if I may put it like that. So we'd like to ask all the panelists about what are your thoughts on India Inc.'s readiness for a data privacy law?
Sure. So thanks, Krishnendra, for asking me the question. And I saw you smiling at me. I knew you were going to throw a googly in. So thanks so much. And in fact, it's probably my fault. I had written an email to him saying this is what I want to talk about. So thanks. So, I mean, I'll try and answer quickly so that, we can conserve time. But basically, I think this is a question which has been asked since quite some time. When GDPR came in, is India Inc. ready? I think, I'm sure all of the publications would have written about it. When CCP came in, perhaps there was some discussion, and of course, from the time Sri Krishna committee came in, the discussion, there's been multiple rounds, etc. And I think it's an important question to ask because, I mean, data, of course, is to restate a oft-quoted term, data is the new oil, and basically everybody is interested in data mining these days. And whether it is, people pick up data of yours from, my sort of quite a silly example, but I like to give it as when you go to any office or any company, you have this big visitors register book and you keep on filling all your information like name, phone number, whatever possible they can get, address there. And from mining that to people mining, cross selling data across, whether it's your healthcare company or your credit card or all kinds of companies, we are constantly processing a lot of data. Quite a few MNCs have their global centers of excellence, capability centers in India, and we collect data and process data for people, employees, payroll data, all kinds of data across the world. We bring it into India, we process it, and there are two issues I feel which need to be sort of thought about. One is, of course, the fact that there's also a strong move within the new bill or the act which will come up of data localization and ensuring all that data, copy of all that data is, parked in India. And two, the structure of this bill keeps on changing, right? So starting from what the Sri Krishna Commission spoke about to including non-personal data within the bill and act to giving significant, I think government was very worried about over-regulation of itself, so giving the government a bit of an exemption from there to, finally what will come up, we don't know. And the people in the committee, parliamentary committee, also keep on changing. But just to answer, I think finally the question whether India Inc. is ready, I would say partially. Some companies are definitely...
1 on 10, we are ready at 2, 3, 4, can't be more than 5. You say partially.
Partially ready. I think you would say probably 3 to 4, I personally would say.
We're not really ready.
Yeah, not
to me, you're saying that India Inc. is not ready for a data privacy law. Satish, your views?
So let me try to answer that. I have a different opinion than what Satyajit is saying. I will say that most of the India INC are ready for the data privacy. For some reason in India, for whatsoever reason we don't know, but for whatsoever reason the privacy laws have not yet been floated, and it keeps differing from one parliament session to another parliament session, and we are, as in India, this is we are the last of the countries, or one of the last of the countries where we have not yet adopted the privacy law. And we already have privacy laws in Europe, in Australia, in Philippines, in South Africa, in other countries. As an organization where we have footsteps in other organizations, other countries, I think we have already geared up for meeting the privacy laws. And I personally have seen that the privacy law is very tough in Australia, even tougher than GDPR. That is my experience, and I have been saying this in various forums that in Australia the privacy law is very tough. You miss out one thing, and immediately you are getting a notice from the customer, and it goes to the privacy board. So I feel that if you are compliant with if you are being compliant with GDPR and other privacy laws for other countries, per se we cannot see in solo. For India, I will say India INC with a registered office in India and a foothold in other parts of the globe, I'll say those India INCs are ready and geared up to meet the privacy laws that are going to come in India. For countries, for organizations which has already a foothold or a registered office outside the country, say for instance in US or Europe, the requirement is the primary already. There have been various organizations like Google and Facebook which has already faced fines and penalties. So they adopting the privacy law has been good to some extent, and I will say that in India they will be easily able to adopt the privacy laws in India as well.
Thank you. We're at 12:50 and we're in the business of time, all of us. Time is money, health is wealth. That's what my mother told me when I was 12 years old. I think I figured out many decades later that the only two things that matter. So I'll take the audience question. Gaurav Vats is asking, and I'll take this to all of you. I'll ask Sumit and Ms. Mehtani to answer. And then if Satyajit and Mr. K. Satish Kumar, you want to take it, you can. Gaurav Vats is commenting, the FIs have very weak contract system. All agreements generally between the borrower and the lender are unfielded. I think he means unfulfilled or signed. This is everment taken in all forums and courts. The banks have very weak governance and checks on this. So he wants the panelists to respond to this, especially fintech companies, to represented on the panel. Sumit, first you.
Yeah. Let me try that with everyone's permission. Look, at the fintech company, there is something called click wrap agreement, right? The concept of click wrap agreement is that it's a standard form, and as a borrower, you're reading those terms and conditions. And most of the fintech actually also provide the flexibility to provide the same agreement in a reasonable vernacular language, right? That's actually one of the guideline or indication RBI has given that somebody sitting in Tamil Nadu or any other state, right, or even Bihar for that matter, probably they may not want to read that all those complex click wrap in a English standard language, and we do provide the option for the same consumer to or the borrower to have request for a copy in a vernacular language, and only once they have understood they to proceed with the transaction. To answer, as a borrower, do you have a flexibility to negotiate that? Probably these are standard terms, right? We are executing at least 1 lakh transaction every day on our platform, right? If we enter into a negotiation, then probably we'll have a huge pile of transaction which will never get closed, right? It's a standard form. The flexibility is that the expectation, right? And there are trainings available. There are even in our app, and so any other fintech, is their responsibility to ensure that if they're borrower, and there are borrowers who reach out to us for a particular question, in the team there is a dedicated team to answer those questions. So yes, in terms of a lender, and that's how the financial space works. Probably a lender, when we also go and raise a 200 or 500 crore debt from any financial institution, a lender will always be in probably a more advantageous position compared to borrower. But to say, eventually all of this works within the fair practice code, right? You cannot charge an exorbitant interest rate. You cannot. So interest rate is one of the key thing, right? Eventually, the way you're collecting your KYC, how you are supposed to deal with that data. Right?
So what are the tweaks required? If you had to be fair to both the lender and the borrower, what would be your recommendation in terms of tweaks in whatever exists? Of course, implementation of a law is another topic by itself in this country, in spite of we know our legal system and the things that the legal system needs to improve. But what are the tweaks you can make which can make sure that the litigation doesn't happen, a fair resolution happens even before going to the court? There's no need.
Just to answer that, once the borrower is clear in terms of the repayment schedule and the interest rate which is being charged, right? To my mind, those are the two critical aspects in any financial transaction happening on a fintech platform. And then following it up with a more humanitarian approach in terms of collection, right? We saw in COVID, the collection ratio really dipping, right? Because of obvious reason, because the business was shut. And we indeed, we at least were conscious in not forcing anyone to pay during that period, right? There was a team which tried to speak to all of these borrowers who were not able to repay, to come out with probably a more flexible way. We went out of the contract to provide them more flexible way. And COVID has taught that to a lot of us, right? That you have to be a little sensitive to the need and not always put business at first and your profit or profitability at the forefront. So we did, I can at least talk about our company, that we did provide that option to the borrowers where they could defer the repayment, right? And only when they were able to be in a position to start making some sort of a payment, right? We restarted that process. So there are ways. I think once a borrower is clear on these important terms, and there is a team which continues, because in our case, these are merchants who have relationship with us for years, right? They're not only taking money from us, they're also using our QR code, they're also using our POS machine. There is a deep entrenchment the merchant has, who in turn becomes a borrower. So yeah, it's very important to be sensitive to the need of your consumer or the target, and then provide them some flexibility and not necessarily go as per the letter of the contract. Maybe a little stringent, because you're obviously, as a lawyers, you will always protect for the downside and the worst case scenario.
There is a question, Supriya Roy, across each of your companies, which type of categories or disputes or breaches or compliance matters have you seen more than usual rise in? So which is a question that Krishnendra had, given the current macro conditions prevailing in your sector's economy. I'll start with Ms. Mehtani first. Ms. Mehtani, are there any category of disputes or breaches or compliance matters that in the last 18 months you've seen kind of grow up?
Yes, I think a lot of arbitrations or dispute resolution relating to termination of contracts, wanting an early termination of contract, those are the ones which have been there because of the financial impact. Every dispute is always related to a financial issue. And therefore, whether it is from a customer perspective or from a vendor perspective or a contractor perspective, or even land deals, it is all a dispute because there's an inability to perform. So that's where, Supriya, we really see the change and disputes which are there. And yes, of course, a lot of ADR is adopted. All of these methods are adopted because apart from the cost impact of litigation, the brand impact, the legal and ethical issues, everything needs to be kept in mind.
Thank you so much. At this point, Krishnan, we'll have to close the webinar. Yes, I think it's time to close, Krishnan. It's time to wrap up, or you can carry on. I have a hard stop at 1. I need to go to a doctor's visit at 1:20. Initially I told you I won't be able to do this webinar. I have a swollen foot, so I really want to go to the doc at 1:20. Close by, so you can carry on. But my question would be, KJ, to everyone, and I'll start with Mr. Satish Kumar this time. He was the last. Your closing comments, and maybe as you move forward, what are the changes in the next 6 to 12 months you see in the regulatory regime, which will bring down the legal risk? That's a question. Quick, very short, specific answer.
Yeah. So the regulatory risk that in the next 6 to 4 months is one on the data privacy, and the other is on the contract compliance, which is very critical. Right now, most of it are not coming within the regulatory part, but contract compliance and should also be brought into the regulatory risk as to how much breaches have happened in the contract. This will to some extent streamline and bring a ring fence the total compliance system in any organization. I think so. So the two major points: data privacy, contract compliance. Yes.
Okay. Sumit, your 2 points or 3 points or 4 points?
I think at least for our sector, fintech sector, given the report which I started with, right, and the report which has just been submitted to RBI and is open for public comment right now, we are going to see fintechs being RBI having a clear oversight and setting out a very some sort of a framework within which the fintech entities will have to be functioning, because right now with so many fintechs, like a wild west, right? There are genuine fintechs entities who are helping in deeper penetration and into semi-urban and rural areas, but there are obviously questionable loan apps which are there who are trying to charge exorbitant interest rate, and RBI obviously wants to strike a balance, and we will see some sort of a regulatory oversight or a framework or a guideline RBI is going to come out with, especially in light of a 150-page report which has been submitted by the that one. And I do see involvement of blockchain in fintech in terms of eKYC or supply trade finance or even the data management. That's something a change or revolution is going to happen. And of course, last but not least, the PDP bill, which obviously Satyajit's, I'll leave that point for Satyajit, but I do think that's also something which is going to impact fintech sector a lot in coming days, given the involvement of data and the number of data fintech entities collect.
Satyajit, your comment. And there are one or two questions that KJ has that he'll continue to ask. But go on, Satyajit.
Of course, the first one for me again remains the privacy issue, and I think every sector to some extent will be impacted. I think we do think sometimes that IT, fintech, the technology sectors get impacted, but a lot of brick and mortar companies do collect a lot of data, and whether it's vendor data, personal, all kinds of individual data, payroll data, and for a lot of captives, they collect a lot of data from around the world. How that gets treated, what happens to it, of course, important to keep an eye out for that. For me, some of the non-legal issues which may raise legal risks also come up. So I think one is getting your future operating model right, whether it's work from home, hybrid working, flexible working. How do you ensure that for the new people they get the ethical foundation right? How do you get how we can ensure integrity and fraud, etc. issues are controlled, mitigated. I think, and finally, I think, and connected to that, a lot of cultural issues come up. And I think when you don't get the culture right, you tend to, have people coming. We have seen a lot of cases in IT sector, for example, people working in various places, taking multiple jobs at the same time, dual employment, various other things. And also,
in tech, the hikes, because new companies are coming in, they're getting 45% to 100% hikes, 200% in spite. So there is a tech boom, at least in terms of
the Great Resignation.
Yes.
Yeah, the Great Resignation has been called by one of the things. And also, one of the companies interestingly recently told me that they're doing a GST check on all their employees, and just to a GST registration check, because a lot of the employees are separately doing engagements privately, and they're working, coding, doing assignments where they, and they've detected a number of employees who, in addition to their regular 9 to 5 or whatever they're doing, they're sitting at night and working and doing projects on their own. So a lot of issues, and I think which will keep, I guess, general counsels, lawyers, the teams busy. And I think it's going to be a great time for the GCs. Back to you, Dr. Batra.
Thank you so much. Final comment from Ms. Mehtani on this issue.
Yes, I'll just keep it very brief. I think that from a sector specific, there are two things that are critical. There is an increased adoption, and it is going to be the way for environmental, social, and governance values. That's going to be an increased trend because of climate change. And as companies, we will need to adopt in the way we construct real estate infrastructure to adapt to ESG requirements. To be compliant, what is going to be required on the regulatory side is a correlation and a cohesive manner in which compliance is required. What we have seen in the last 1.5 years is a lot of sporadic construction circulars which keep coming, and that's particularly impacting the ability to comply, because there's no consequential impact which has been looked into for any other or related sector.
Thank you so much. Back to you, KJ, for your final set of questions.
Yeah, so I have just one final closing question to all the panelists. How do you see legal compliance frameworks changing with the emergence of big data, analytics, AI? And what will be your top 3 trends for 2022 when we discuss the compliance landscape?
Sure. Okay. So yes, I think the entire pandemic's been an accelerant for adoption of AI, Krishnendra. And any meaningful compliance can really take place only with analytics and AI. We've already spoken about data privacy, and my colleagues have done that. But I think what's going to be relevant is the accountability. That's become essential when we start using AI for compliance, since there are several legal implications. Now, whether we start with ownership and protection considerations under copyright or trademark, or we're talking of antitrust and competition laws, I think what is really become relevant is the impact of AI and decision making at the board level. If we see what's happening in Hong Kong and California, where their substitution of a director by AI has actually been done, where one of the companies in Hong Kong, a VC firm, was using Vital as which is a machine learning program, for those who don't know, where it is capable of giving investment recommendations, and that's Vital is on the board. Now, we haven't reached as a country to that level of AI, but yes, that's where we are eventually going to get there when we start using AI even at board levels, or we have to see how AI pans out even at a corporate governance level, because we are using AI to analyze customer preferences, the data of the customers, competitor analysis. So what are the protocols that are really being followed so that the legal requirements are not getting compromised and exposing the board for any kind of risk. The laws itself will need change as we use AI, and that's the last point that I'll make on this, where because we're using that AI in compliance, using AI in the way we're going forward, there has to be a mechanism to really distinguish what is an error in judgment and what is an error in intent. And that is where the laws will have to change if we have to see an integration with AI.
Apart from AI, and obviously AI is going to play a very important role in fintech. If I have to pick among the top 2-3 sectors, fintech would definitely form part of that, right? Even the kind of data fintech companies deal with. So other than that, while I was speaking earlier, I also touched upon blockchain technology. I think there are several reports which seem to suggest that it's a matter of time, right? And India, in fact, this is already happening globally, and just a matter of time that this comes to India, that blockchain will play a very important role even in fintech sector in terms of eKYC, data management, supply financing, or even to process the payment, right? I don't think any of the fintech companies yet ready to, but we will have to be, and that's just a matter of time. That's another trend which I definitely see coming up. The other, obviously, with the data privacy law, companies, some of the companies who are part of the global multinational they have a subsidiary in India, probably they are better placed, having experienced GDPR in Europe and other privacy facing other larger. If you're part of a larger organization or a multinational, probably you're better placed to deal with it because you're already seeing that happening with at a global level. So the Indian companies probably a little late to wake up and understand the kind of impact this will have on the business. So it's very important. That's another trend which is going to in next 6 to 9 months, right? When we go in the second quarter of 2022, where companies will have to quickly adapt to the data privacy laws and to ensure that their business processes, the documentation, the way they store their data, the fact that today if you tell a fintech company that they're going to delete all the data the moment the loan has been repaid because that borrower has repaid the loan, probably that's something which will really, they would not have heard something like that, right? I think it's on the legal and the regulatory team and the compliance team to make the business sensitive and to sensitize them around the impact this is going to have once implemented. So these are my broad trends which I see happening in next few months.
Mr. Kumar, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I agree that, with the AI coming into the picture, we need to have a strict regulatory framework for bringing in AI and compliance. AI is here to stay, and all the organizations, especially the fintech organization, are adopting AI in a big way. And we need to have a regulatory aspect around the AI and also compliance system built for AI, so that we channelize it in the right direction, and also use it to our advantage of AI. There is sky is the limit. You can use it to any extent that is possible. So at the same time, it's a wild beast. You should be very careful of how it has to be used. So I think we should have a ring fence it through with regulatory aspects and compliance aspects, so that AI is used to our advantage.
So I think it's a very interesting question. I think a lot of points have already been covered. So don't want to get into AI and of course how one must sort of work on ensuring that bias by AI is sort of mitigated, and what steps we can take. I would only say, and I think in some way to repeat very briefly, that fact remains that AI is going to be a very, of course, for a lot of companies, an important tool for complying with various regulations, governance frameworks, etc. And for various companies, AI is a great business opportunity as well. So for us, we do a lot of AI ML solutions. So I think it's and again for us also the focus is on how we are able to demonstrate that we are training and we are creating AI tools which work as far as possible and as close as possible to how a human mind or human analysis would work, and with the only thing being, of course, with lesser errors and with great accuracy. So I think as I sort of said when Dr. Batra asked me for his for the comments, I feel that look, truly a great time to be in-house counsel, and I think there's a lot to deal with, a lot of opportunities, and I look forward to interacting more with the business world and BW legal world with time, and I think we'll learn from each other. I think there's a lot of learning and a lot of discussions which are bound to come up. So thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for each one of you for this wonderful 360-degree conversation. We look forward to having more such interactions too.